So there is a piece on the Times, page 2. Finance watchdog gets 10,000 complaints linked to COVID-19. And it says that the complaints related to the pandemic included almost 6,000 complaints from borrowers between July and September about COVID-related problems with loans, the ombudsman said. And the Church of England is reportedly rethinking same-sex marriage. And Rishi Sunak, the finance minister, is kind of quoting Tory MPs in the north of England with promise of post-pandemic cash in those regions. And the Times says that the pandemic virus can be beaten, but don't drop our guard. And the most vulnerable at the front of the queue for the vaccine, says the Times, on the page, next page, which is page 10. And councils and the NHS are going to start screening in days with instant tests. And it's all about the headlines, all about the kind of headlines, not about the actual reality. That is what Fleet Street has been doing, running headlines. And there is a piece in the Times about children, school children forgot how to spell after 9 months out of school. And on pages 18 and 19, the double spread, dominated by a headline about Trump having sacked his defense secretary over the election result. And the French have arrested traffickers who sent 1,000 migrants to Britain. And of course, there is a piece about a member of the House of Peers referring to Kamala Harris as the Indian. And a rare piece in the Times on page 28. Metropolitan police officer duped a campaigner into having sex with him, and then he disappeared. An undercover police officer tricked an activist whose group he had infiltrated into having sex in 2015, shortly before Theresa May announced a public inquiry into the scandal. And this is written by Fiona Hamilton, crime editor. The Metropolitan Police officer, who was using the pseudonym Rob Harrison, contacted his former girlfriend out of the blue, had sex with her, and vanished again. He did so despite years of public scrutiny about the tactics of covert units, including the strategy of tricking women into relationships. Yesterday, the undercover policing inquiry was told of the trauma suffered by the families of dead children whose identities were assumed by officers. Many visited the child's hometown to familiarize themselves with the area. Look at that. Police doing this, yeah? And there is a piece about what Joe Biden cannot do. He says, the piece by John Prideaux says that Biden won't solve America's big problems. And that means that individual states won't be getting the kind of help they need. And there is a piece and a letter about campaign to save composers' archive. Sir Malcolm Arnold, 1921 to 2006, was one of the most important British composers of classical music in the 20th century. From 1979 to 1986, he was in the care of the Court of Protection. And for the remainder of the office of his life, the Court of Protection and the Office of the Public Guardian played a significant role in his protection as a vulnerable person. Over this period, the court accumulated a considerable archive of records, papers, and personal correspondence. This collection is of great importance to researchers, biographers, and musicologists. Until recently, it had been the stated intention of the Court of Protection that these records would be preserved. However, it has now been stated that it intends to destroy the entire collection, as it believes that all possible options for preserving the records have been exhausted. We urge the government to intervene to prevent the destruction of the records relating to this significant British artist and to ensure that they are lodged in the National Archives. Among the names as the signatories are Catherine Arnold, daughter of Sir Malcolm Arnold, Rachel Bond, college librarian, Eton College, William Boyd, novelist, Sally Cavender, Faber Music, Paul Harris, Malcolm Arnold Festival, Sally Ann Claybed, Julian Lloyd Webber, Dame Monica Mason, Michael Meredith, librarian emeritus, Eton College, Tony Meredith, biographer, David Nixon, Northern Ballet, Tony Palmer, film director and composer, Dr. Chris Rassman, Mark Skipper, Northern Ballet, Michael White, music critic, Barry Wordsworth. Now, this is something that we can start talking about today. Today's Times, that is the letter about the archives, and it is the absolute appropriate word and the concept to talk about today, the 10th of November, 2020. On 10th of November, that was a Wednesday. Today is a 10th of November, a Tuesday, but on Wednesday, 10th of November 1993, a woman called Henrietta Manners, sitting as the district judge in the then Shoreditch County Court, continued her racist lying and misinformed the particular party that was the target of her lying, and gave the excuse and the pretext and the window in terms of time for the criminal Paul Varma. Now, Paul Varma is the name of the criminal who bought the property put on the auction by the Royal London Hospital in New Road in 1987. Paul Varma, whose name I have edited into Varmin because of his behavior, went to the auction where I also went, and he bought the property number 15 New Road, London E1 1HE in 1987. So from October 1987, which was 3 years after I decided to engage the resources and the kind of organizing abilities of my campaigns to defending, quote, the good name of a person that had tearfully sought the help of the Tower Hamlets Race Equality Council at the beginning of February 1984. Now, the role played by Henrietta Manners, who is a barrister, licensed law trading barrister and racist criminal liar, the role she played was added to the actual reason or links to the chain of destruction to the archives. And we shall be updating on the description of the archives that underlie this assumption and this assertion and this evidential commentary. That because of the destruction, because of the attack on the archives, on that day and on the days previous to that, during the several kind of attempts through the Shoreditch County Court to stop the attacks, contributed to the destruction of so much time and so much evidence and so much supporting materials originally created from New Road or at New Road and at other addresses which I shall be listing. And that is where the items should be contextually kind of imagined. Because here in this broadcast, the physical materials are not present before the camera. So it has to be an intelligent contextual imagination based on the evidence. And we shall be going through that in this edition quite in detail. Up to the time of the break, which will be done in about an hour's time, in order to coincide with the midday prayer time in London. About the time, because the midday prayer time has already begun, but it lasts a kind of space, a length. And what happened with Henrietta Manners, that name Manners is the exact opposite of what she has done. She has displayed, as a racist, the worst possible manners. And she has abused the position as the district judge concerned in there. Now, Henrietta Manners became a serial attacker of the rights of the party that was being already attacked by Tower Hamlets Council's own racist liar criminal, Steve Hill. Because several, I think about 6 separate applications to the county court in Shoreditch at the time were made applying for the eviction. The very eviction and the very target of the eviction that had been targeted by Michael the racist liar, criminal crook, Tyrrell, Tyrrell. Now, this criminal racist liar, Tyrrell, was still employed in the housing section of the Tower Hamlets Council at the time. Throughout the period, starting from July 1996 up to the end of January 2001, the Michael Tyrrell targeted the particular target for eviction, and he didn't have any reason for targeting the particular target for eviction. So he set about conspiring with Tower Hamlets Council, and in particular, he set up a series of conspiracies with Steve Hill and anyone else that was involved with Steve Hill, whether they met together to confect the various separate items of eviction plot or not. It didn't make any difference because the agenda remained the same, and they continued to look for excuses to kind of make a almost kind of formal looking application before a county court seeking the eviction of the person. Now, the person they targeted is not a criminal. In fact, this is the person that has been campaigning all their kind of campaigning years for the highest standards in public life, highest standards of ethics and morality and legality and constitutionality and due process, rule of law and all the rest of it. So these criminals, although they started to look for pretexts they could use to have an order by the county court to evict this person, these criminals were failing, and they kept failing to get an order. So that was 5 years up to the end of January 2001, and then add another 10 years up to July 2011, when the court had merged. Now this Shoreditch County Court had become the second part of the merged court, that is Clerkenwell and Shoreditch County Court. And Henrietta Manners had remained a district judge based at the same court or the merged court. So all the criminals, Henrietta Manners, the judge, and the housing manager, Michael Tyrrell, and the housing benefits manager, Steve Hill, and the housing homeless kind of section manager, Colin Cormack, they were all in their relevant positions throughout the 15 years. So if you look at the list of people, one district judge and at least 4 full-time employees of the local council operating for 15 years non-stop to get a court order to evict somebody for no reason except that the person they were targeting for eviction had been the upholder of the highest moral standards, ethical standards, in addition to the other responsibilities that we have been kind of mentioning in relation to their duties to rescue a very dangerously kind of trapped, vulnerable person in Bangladesh, and also to help a group of children, orphaned children in Tower Hamlets. So instead of helping a helper, in fact, instead of helping the only helper as a human being that could be kind of playing a very decisive rescuing role in helping the vulnerable person dangerously trapped in Bangladesh and a number of children, orphan children, exposed to any number of abuses while allegedly living in Tower Hamlets. The Tower Hamlets Council knew about the vulnerability of the children. And the Tower Hamlets Council decided to continue to neglect the children. Instead, Tower Hamlets Council continued to attack the only carer and helper that could save these children from the abuses and protect them and also help them avoid the traumatizing, emotional, and other psychological stress and distress and desperation. So what happened on the 10th of November, we are marking the anniversary today, 10th of November. 10th of November 1993 was that this Henrietta Manners sat in the Shoreditch County Court. And there was a letter sent to the person at their address at 15 New Road, London E1 1HE, directing them to attend the court because there would be a hearing of their application to defer the eviction. When the person appeared at the Shoreditch County Court, there was no notice, there was no direction, there was no mention on the wall on the list of hearings listed for that day, that morning. There was nothing. And the caretaker or the kind of receptionist at the entrance to the Shoreditch County Court on that day was asked, and he couldn't give a convincing or clear kind of direction. He directed the person to look at the wall's notices, which had already been looked at. And those notices contained no references to the hearing. If there was any notice, then that wouldn't be actually true, because when the person checked into various rooms, court rooms, on the first floor or second floor, where the supposed hearing was to take place, there was no indication that any hearing was taking place, and there was no kind of notice outside the door, outside the particular courtroom or rooms, saying where exactly that particular hearing was going to happen. The actual reports and the records of what happened on that day in the court in terms of locating a courtroom and locating the details of the notice and also identifying the actual letter that was sent to the address, those were contained in the kind of documents that were later kind of interfered with. So at this stage, it is not possible to put in front of the camera anything from those documents, except to say the basic thing as follows. Because there was no hearing, or at least no hearing could be identified or established, there could not be any application kind of progressed to delay the eviction. So the particular person returned to New Road. And when they returned to New Road, after about 90 minutes or 2 hours of the return journey, including the time spent in looking for the alleged kind of hearing of the application, which wasn't identifiable as a hearing at the time. They found two police women, two white Metropolitan Police women, and this criminal called Paul Varma, the Barmin. They were loitering outside the door at 15 New Road. And the two police women, without any formality, without anything, they addressed the person in an aggressive way and said that they couldn't go in. They were being evicted. They had been locked out. Which means that when the court sent that letter, either it was a bogus letter in order to take the person away from the address at that time so that Paul Barmin could arrive there with the police during the absence of the person and lock the place, preventing access by the person back to his home. Now, this is the kind of description that needs to be put on the record, the detailed description. Because when the Royal London Hospital failed to carry out repairs to the building, after the Royal London Hospital was told in September 1987 that a ceiling, plastering at the ceiling, had fell on the basement, narrowly avoiding hitting two persons. When they were told about this, they should have carried out repairs. Instead of carrying out repairs, instead of apologizing, instead of offering any help, the Royal London Hospital, without telling the tenants and the persons occupying the building, put that property and a few dozen other properties along the road on auction. That happened in September 1987. For anyone who is not familiar with East London or Tower Hamlets, and anyone who is not familiar with the less publicly known titles and publications that deal with kind of deprivation, social situations, etc., and anyone who has not read the necessary amount of literature, let alone investigative reports about social conditions that have been existing in Tower Hamlets for decades, cannot find the information in today's newspapers or in any edition of the papers that were published in September 1987 or have been published since. Because the character or the lack of character of the Fleet Street newspapers contains the disdain to society, ordinary people. And the operation called newspapers is actually done by the son of the devil, or the son and the daughter of the devil. Contrary to the myth that in Britain the papers are free, they are the opposite. They are not free. They are completely kind of tied to the agenda of the devil and the evil and the liars. So it doesn't apply just to one title. And despite the fact that I've read at the beginning of this edition read the letter about the archives of a particular kind of person that has been mentioned in there, the use of the term archives is not kind of made universally by the newspapers, including by the Times or the Guardian or the others in Fleet Street. Archives only matter when they are archives of white people. Think about that. Because what happened on the 10th of November 1993 was 6 years after the collapse of the ceiling. Because those 6 years were spent in opposing the attack by eviction of the occupant and the eviction of the archives. Now, the archives is a misleading word. The actual word is action archives, because they are accumulating every 24 hours. And as I speak now, they are still accumulating, although there has been a lot of robbery, which we shall be updating on. But the permanent, evidential, factual, investigative, moral, and contextual work that I have been doing, which is what the archives are created and created for and created by, which I have been doing for a very long time. There are some fixed actions that have to be taken every day, every 24 hours. That is, first of all, checking the printed publications like Fleet Street, what we are doing here, and checking other sources that are not necessarily that kind of disciplined, in terms of you cannot pick up a newspaper to find out what is going on in the local area. And you cannot pick up a newspaper to find out what's happening to individual victims of injustice, whose kind of sufferings and whose encounters and whose experiences are not necessarily automatically available on the air, because there is no means or media or medium. So that entails making inquiries by other means. And then there is the logistical question of defending the spot, the address, the place. Because in addition to the attacks from the Royal London Hospital, other sources of attacks were taking place. And those attackers came from different backgrounds, and they were of different genders and ages. But one thing they had in common. They had in common what I have factually, evidentially decided to describe in shorthand, if you like, as the pre-Lilliputian kind of demography based on their behavior. Pre-Lilliputian is a reference to the people, not necessarily in terms of their sizes as compared to the sizes of them being too small compared to Gulliver, but their absence, the lack of any brains, is what they have in common. Now, the brains has to be qualified by an additional qualifier called relevant brains, because they had brains to keep them going and going about their kind of lowest common denominator kind of engagements. But they lacked the necessary, the relevant brains that would have kind of enable them to at least understand cognitively, to at least understand the concept of the various work that was kind of involved in the archives and in the occupation of the kind of property, the address being 15 New Road, and the space and the parts of the building were the basement, 2 rooms on the basement, and the ground floor, 2 rooms on the ground floor, back and front. And the essential use and utility of those 4 rooms was, in one word, as an action, or one phrase, if you like, action archive. Collected items from the past, including last hour, and items being worked on currently, this hour. And these activities included materially, physically, in terms of archives, all the modes and all the media that were available, that were accessible, including various types of camera, various types of storage devices, whatever the particular modes and models were, and various written materials, and various titles, and various kind of sources, and for kind of formats. And all of these were left at the address on the 10th of November, when the so-called court appointment was supposed to be kind of kept. And there was no court appointment, at least from this distance, because the actual documents of the day are not accessible at this minute. There was no court hearing. And that information was a misleading, intentionally criminally perpetrated miscommunication in order to take the person away from their address, so that the 2 Metropolitan Police women or any other replacement of them and the criminal Paul Varma could arrive there and do what they did, to ineffectively declare the place being under eviction. Now, this was the second phase after the kind of series of court actions were begun against Paul Varma. Because Paul Varma, the racist, the liar, had communicated that he needed to have the possession of the property. So he did that immediately after he got the auction purchase of the place, sometime in October or November 1987. And he started to kind of reconnoiter, like he was traveling around the place, looking at who was coming in, who was coming out, and whatever. And then he made contacts with members of the same family, but they were not in occupation. They were in occupation at another place nearby, but not on that property. So he, Paul, the criminal liar Varma, or Varmin, made contacts with those people, and he began his lying campaign. He offered them money. He said that if they could persuade the actual occupant to vacate the place, then he, Paul Varmin, would pay those people £40,000 altogether. Not one single person, but a kind of, let's say, a group of two groups of people that he approached. Now, £40,000 to a number of people like that would appear to be a significant amount of money, even in 1987, early 88. But £40,000, even if it were to be delivered, would not even register on the table of losses. Even £400,000 would not register. Even £400 million would not register. But it wasn't £400 million at all. It was only £40,000. And it was less than £40,000 because the actual occupation of the ground floor and the basements related to one person, and their biological family living or situated 2 streets away nearby, that family was being kind of lured to accept the proposition of a bribe of £20,000 if they could get the occupant out of the place, if they could persuade. Now, this is such a complex and truly extraordinary kind of detail in the story and activities, this collection, if you like, all this stuff, that anyone viewing this must keep checking what I'm saying in the previous section, because there is a lot of very complicated linked facts to absorb and understand, and anything missed will completely kind of derail the commentary and the understanding and the narrative and the picture. And I'm making kind of taking pauses of a minute or so in order to enable the person to absorb, anyone watching this. Remember our disclaimer that on this account or this kind of campaign, we do not follow or tout for or recruit friends, and we don't encourage friends. So therefore, this publication, this kind of broadcast is not about numbers. In fact, we don't encourage numbers. It makes no difference whether 100,000 people are watching this or only one person is watching this. It makes no difference. What does make the difference is our putting the record on the record, evidence on the record. That is what matters. So when they made that false communication about the appointment being at the Shoreditch County Court on the 10th of November 1993, that was 6 years. Remember that 6 years after the ceiling collapsed in September 1987. So 87, 89, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93. 6 years and 2 months later, the ceiling collapsed on a date between, let's say, 10th of September to 23rd or 24th of September 1987. And we shall go to Brick Lane on this particular tangent, but we'll come back to New Road from Brick Lane. The Brick Lane reference is that shortly after the ceiling collapsed, that collapse actually caused the problem in using a portable typewriter for doing the necessary copy of the paper that was still in production, the weekly rights, the Vadika rights paper. So, for whatever reason, on a day that I was walking through Brick Lane, I encountered or bumped into this person called Brendan O'Sullivan. And I bumped into him not far from outside, far from the address at 170 Brick Lane, where the then Spitalfields Housing Co-op was based at. And in a short conversation, I had said to Brendan O'Sullivan words to the effect that he was helping the Spitalfields Housing Co-op, and he was not a resident of Tower Hamlets, but he was helping them, quite apart from being employed by them. He was helping out of goodness of his heart, and he was trying to be helpful, which was perfectly okay by me. But I needed him to understand. That is what I said, words to the effect. I needed him to understand that my criticism of him on an earlier occasion, when I telephoned him very early in the morning one day and told him that he should not help criminality being done under the cover of the Spitalfields Housing Cooperative. Now that would have been maybe a few months before the actual meeting I had with him at that time in 1987. And my purpose was the same then as it is the same now. So it's more than 35 years or 34 years or 33 years, whatever the number of years, it is more than 30 years that have been they've been past, we have come past, let's say 30 plus years since those events. And when I condemned Brendan O'Sullivan for his helping the criminals, I was not motivated by any agenda against the individual criminals. I still am not. But I had to tell him that the housing cooperative had been established in order to help people with housing, genuine help that was not available through the council, local council or by the GLC. And I said that if the cooperative was abused by any number of criminals who got hold of its management and kind of control, then that would be a very severe betrayal of the rights of the people who most needed help in housing. Brendan Sullivan or Brendan O'Sullivan did not disagree with me on anything. In fact, he said words to the effect that he could help if I would accept access to the office of the Spitalfields Housing Co-op at 170 Brick Lane to do some of the work that I couldn't do from New Road at the time. And he took me upstairs and showed me a Bengali language typewriter, which I began to use for the Adhikar newspaper. Remember, it was the Bangladeshi newspaper, and it needed to have Bangladeshi contents in it. And there was no typing. In 1987, there was no computer that had any kind of text input facilities containing the Bangla language or any of these languages. And most organizations didn't have a Bangla language typewriter. And this organization did have. And it was entirely the initiative of Brendan O'Sullivan, whose initiative was motivated by, in my understanding, an outlook to help somebody do the campaign for the community. Because until that, broadly that time, I had not known him except the telephone call, but even that was a novelty because I had to do the phone call after hearing that somebody was helping these particular individuals do some wrong things under the covers of the Spitalfield Cooperative, Housing Cooperative. So it was a very kind of original, initial kind of encounter, meeting between myself and Brendan O'Sullivan. And he showed that he understood the principles and the values, and I appreciated and recognized his understanding and his offer. And so continued to use the typewriter and the photocopier because there was no printing facilities for the Adhikar Weekly. And having been engaged by Varmin with serial litigation attacks and the constant uncertainty about being kind of free from attacks on the action archives by him, it was made a kind of emergency situation. So even if I went to 170 Brick Lane to use the Bengali language typewriter, I would have done that for very short periods of time. I could not stay there for the necessary length that I would have been preferring to stay for in order to do the necessary length of articles in typing, because the use of a Bengali typewriter, unlike the keyboard of a computer now, that was completely different because the use entailed really long time to use the keyboard, and the Bengali language is not part of the computerized kind of keyboard, the alphabet and whatever at that time. And it took very long time before it got anywhere near being usable in the computer age as we know it now. But at that time, the access to that Bengali typewriter was significant because there was no other typewriter that could be used. I was not interested in what the housing co-op was doing as a housing co-op at any time that I was visiting that address. I solely visited the address to get the access to the typewriter and the photocopier. So they would have cost, every time I used that would have been amounting to, let's say, about 4 or 5 pounds. But if it is translated, if my work is translated in terms of the impact and the role that it was playing, and if the kind of cost were to be measured by using the same criteria used by David Panic in charging the Manchester City Football Club for £20,000 a year for a day, then it would be like several thousand pounds of my time that I was giving to the cause, to the campaign, including the beneficiaries altogether of the housing co-op and the entire community. So this is a thought, this is a kind of point to think about. And what happened, we shall be talking another 15 minutes in this part. As the attacks, letters and intimidation and other things continued, and as the members of the biological family kept expressing their being under pressure from Bahrain by asking me whether I would accept their suggestion that I should leave. Now, when I say pre-Lilliputian, that is the kind of incident that I refer to. My answer to them was that there was no place other than in private kind of occupation and ownership that the work could be transferred to. What they were saying was that go to a council house, a council flat. Even in 1987, access to council housing was next to impossible. Especially impossible for somebody who is not, quote, officially married or living with a married spouse, and worse, that haven't got a child. So the priority has never been decided by including any of the original contributions to society that a writer, an activist, a campaigner, an author, an organizer, a translator, a poet can make. These are all assumed to not exist. So pre-Lilliputian applies to the council as well as the people who made the laws, so-called, or the regulations about public housing or social housing. And most certainly, the pre-Lilliputian applies to the behavior, not necessarily the inherent abilities. These people might have had inherent cognitive abilities that were different from Lilliputians. So I make the distinction. The way they behaved about the housing and the totality of their stupidity in repeatedly ignoring the advice that was coming from me. Now, I am not an advisor in the conventional sense of the bureaucratic term. I'm an advisor of unique evidence and achievement in getting my advice right and in getting all my advice vindicated on anything. So I'm unique in that way. Not unique because I want to be compared with some narcissistic kind of counterpart. It is the fact. And there was no place, no lawyer, no licensed lawyer, nobody who could match my knowledge and perspective. They could not do that in 1987, and they have not been able to do that in the 33, 34 years since then. And everything that I have been having to encounter and endure and deal with as a result of the pre-Lilliputian stupidity of these people and the pre-Lilliputian behavior of the council and the totally pre-Lilliputian corruption and criminality and stupidity of the morons that were controlling the so-called Spitalfields Housing Cooperative in 1987. This is why the complexity is so complex because there are so many layers of idiots and morons that have been in the way of setting up the unique, world-class, unique series of much needed world standard and world kind of applicable solutions to the world's problems. That is what I was engaged in doing when I was interrupted, and this has been a 34, 35-year-old or long interruption by sets of pre-Lilliputians. The morons said they suspended whenever they must have been thinking about the money that was in their head. Whenever they said about the housing available through the councils, they must have kind of completely suspended all connection with the reality. And they must have mistaken me for an image of a person who, in the council's bureaucraties, had the highest priority, like they had the pregnant wife with 2 disabled children or something. Now, I didn't have any of those things, so I could not be ahead of the list. Remember the head of the housing waiting list? The concept has been used in the Murdoch's Sun or Scum newspaper reporting the 3 charges on housing fraud that have been leveled against Afsana Begum. Now, the fact is that she got her allocation when she was in her mid-20s. Now, although I was older in 1987 than her in that time, the essential fact that I recognized instantly was that council, even 1-bedroom flat would not be available to me because I didn't have the kind of child or family. The child and the family that I do have and they did have was of a different kind of description. It is the whole community. And the resources that I was absolutely concerned about protecting were the action archives, which the pre-Lilliputian in control of the council are not aware of. They don't recognize any intellectual content. So when the pre-Lilliputians approaching me on a kind of daily basis kind of argued, they were not even thinking who they were trying to advise, because I had been advising all of them all my life, and there was no part of the kind of advice that I had got wrong. But being pre-Lilliputians, they were hijacked mentally into thinking that my kind of real advice to them that the council was not going to house, they convinced themselves that that was some kind of excuse. And they must have convinced themselves by thinking as pre-Lilliputians. That is stupider than the most stupid set of people. And they became stupider than the most stupid set of people simply by being targeted by Paul Vermin with the lure of £20,000. Now, that was happening. That kind of thing was happening more than 30 years ago. This is now 10th of November 2020. And Paul Vermin has not given them even 20 pence. What he has done, he has caused damage that would need more than the entire collected known kind of money available to the whole of the Republic of India. That is what I'm meaning. That is what I'm saying. It would be worth billions, the damage that they've caused. So if I call them pre-Lilliputians, I'm not being at all harsh or unrealistic or disrespectful. Because in their behavior, remember what I'm saying. I'm not saying in their humanity, because their humanity I recognize then and I recognize now, but their humanity is not at issue. What they were doing was denying the reality. And I know the reality better than they did then, and I still do. And I had before on other serious issues and kind of crisis that I had solved. I had demonstrated by getting it right every time, as far as my advice to them or on issues that they sought my advice on were concerned. So how could they repeatedly suspend their complete idiotic kind of denial of me? Suspend my reality and my evidence, my records, and turn all of that into an abstract darkness of emptiness. Because they kept repeating the advice, I should go to the council. Now these are pre-Lilliputians. And I have been going to the council for the last 32, 33 years. Now where to begin condemning these morons on their behavior? Not morons as human beings, but their moronic behavior.